Welcome back to Lecture 5. We're going to be applying the functional perspective to the criminal justice system. Similar to the conflict approach, we're going to be applying the functional perspective to the state, laws, and lawmakers. The structural functional perspective looks at the state very differently than the conflict approach. Thomas Hobbes, who was sort of an early structural functional scholar, he didn't call himself that, but when you look at his work, it reflects the assumptions of structural functionalism. Basically, he argues that the state emerged because there was chaos. There was a war of all against all. If somebody wanted something, they took it from someone else. If one family wronged another family, there was a family feud, and there would be violence, and they were living in a sort of a state of insecurity and a lack of trust. Hobbes argues that it was this chaos that led to the emergence of the state. Citizens, or people, agreed to surrender some of their liberty for safety, security, trust, and justice. He said it was basically a scary place to live, where you didn't know whether you were going to be alive or dead from one day to the next. And people had absolute freedom. There was liberty. You could do whatever you wanted. You could go and kill somebody almost with impunity, except for the fact that their family or friends might try to kill you. People gave up some of their liberty for the sake of safety, security, trust, and justice. If you think about the conflict perspective, it's a very different story. The conflict perspective argued that the state arose because there were rich people and there were poor people, and it was rich against poor. This perspective argues no rich, no poor. It was a war of all against all. And people willingly surrendered some of their liberty. It's a very different story from the conflict approach. What about lawmaking today? What about, laws, lawmaking, and regulations today? The structural functional perspective argues that it is not a power elite of military, corporate, and political elite who are running the government from behind like a puppet master. They argue that we have a system called pluralism. Pluralism is the idea that there are many interest groups. There's the automotive interest group. There's the environmental interest groups. There are the Wall Street interest groups. There are citizen interest groups like the VFW and the American Legion and the Veterans of Iraq War. And these interest groups basically push and prod for change. According to the functional approach, these are not rich interest groups or poor interest groups. Basically, it's any group of Americans who can come together behind a common cause and ask for change. Everyone benefits from the lawmaking process. Everyone has access to the lawmaking process. This perspective doesn't say one man, one vote, because we're sociologists, and the idea that one man and one vote changes things is a little bit too idiosyncratic for a sociologist. Sociologists are group people. So when we look at politics, we say, sure, we elect people every 4 years, but the thing of politics is something that goes on daily. It's not, you don't just elect somebody every 4 years and that's democracy, or that's politics. Politics is happening every day. So how does it happen for a structural functionalist? Interest group politics. It's called pluralism. What's the role of government in this system? For the structural functionalist, the government is a neutral arbitrator. He's like an umpire or a referee at a sporting event. Does the referee or an umpire have an interest in who wins? No. The referee is just trying to call a fair game, trying to uphold the rules. The rules are very important for referees and umpires. And they want to make decisions that works best for everybody. What's good for football? If you're a football referee, well, you want a good game where the fans enjoy it and the players have a good time and it's a competitive game and it's fun. So it's not about who wins and who loses. It's about what's best for everyone. And from the structural functional perspective, the way politics works is anyone has access. Interest groups are sort of putting pressure on government, and the government doesn't say, I like this interest group or I like that interest group. The government's saying, okay, make your case, let me know what you say, I'll think about what's best for the people as a whole, and I will offer, a decision. That's what the government does, the people in the government. Again, this is very different from the conflict perspective, which argues that only the power elite have access to government. Everyone else thinks they have access to government through voting and things like that. And according to the conflict approach, the government is just a facade that's sort of making us have the illusion of democracy when we don't. The structural functional perspective says we do have democracy. The government is sort of this neutral referee that sort of makes decisions, so it's best for everyone. But the government gets the pressure from interest groups. So what about crime? The functional perspective says we create laws that are in the interest of everyone. Everyone has the ability to give feedback on laws. But crime still happens, so why? Well, the structural functional perspective sees crime very different from the conflict perspective. The conflict perspective might say crime is not inevitable and it's not functional to our society. The functional perspective would say the opposite. Crime is inevitable and it is very functional to our society. Well, how is crime functional? Well, crime is setting the example of unacceptable behavior. Sometimes, as a teacher, I try to do my best to teach something, and then a student comes along and does it wrong. And for me, that's, okay, let me explain to everyone why this is wrong. It's very useful for a teacher when students get things wrong, because then you can explain why it's wrong and why you're right. Same thing goes on with crime. The government tells us, drive 55 miles per hour. But then somebody comes along and drives 85 miles per hour while they're drunk, and it sets the example. Look, unacceptable behavior. Look, that person died, or that person killed somebody else driving 85 miles per hour and being drunk. So it sets the example of unacceptable behavior. Now we all remember, oh yeah, 55 is the speed limit, and we created that for the good of everyone. So crime is functional because it sets the example of unacceptable behavior. Crime provides a guideline for behavior that is necessary to maintain order. Crime binds us together. When that person drives drunk and drives 85 miles per hour down the road and kills someone, the community comes together, points at that guy, and says, you, my friend, are an asshole. You drove drunk, you killed somebody, we all hate you. So do you see how crime actually creates a community? We all come together hating the criminal. So for the functional perspective, crime is functional because it brings us together. Two other ideas about crime, how it's functional to our society. It can signal a problem that needs to be addressed. Maybe we keep on having the same problem with the same crime over and over and over. That can flag our society that, hey, this thing needs to change. Maybe our policemen need to do something different. Maybe our medical professionals need to do something different. Maybe our Hollywood industry needs to do something different. But something needs to change. And that can be functional to our society. It can stimulate positive change. Remember, society is always adapting. So crime can help us adapt. The last idea is that crime opens societies to new and creative paths of thinking. This one is kind of a slippery slope one. It's kind of interesting if you think about it. The idea here is that, let's think about, tax laws. The government establishes tax laws. Well, you know what most corporations do every time there's new tax laws? They buy themselves a whole bunch of tax attorneys. They read through the tax law, and they try to figure out ways to get around the tax law. This happens everywhere. Think about people with the internet. The internet's created. We have laws saying you cannot pirate music and movies. So people think of innovative ways to get around the law. And it can basically stimulate innovation in our society. It's possible that we create a law to stop people from doing something, and they innovate in such a way that it creates a good idea. Maybe, the criminal is just innovating to get around the law. But sometimes people might innovate in a way that's actually rather productive to society. So you can think about that one for a little while. For the structural functional perspective, crime is functional and inevitable. For the conflict perspective, it is neither inevitable or functional. Even the idea that crime can be functional to a society is it's a scary idea. For the conflict approach, they'd say, if somebody gets murdered, how is that functional for our society? That's not functional, that's dysfunctional. Someone was murdered. People shouldn't be murdered. Could that murder have been stopped? The conflict approach says yes. The functional approach, no way. Crime is inevitable. We can't get rid of it, and it's functional. So again, we're going to look at monitoring, enforcement, and generating of data from the structural functional perspective. This perspective looks at law enforcement, and they look at the manifest function. What is law enforcement for? Providing safety and security to citizens, and basically detaining suspected criminals. If somebody's a suspected criminal, we want our law enforcement to grab them, find them, get them off the streets. What is a latent function of law enforcement? Well, it's providing a lot of jobs. Crime in general creates a lot of jobs. The conflict perspective would look at that factor and say, well, then there's a lot of people who are benefiting from the system. The functional approach would say it's a latent function. We don't, there are crimes, they happen. We need people to take care of the criminals. And yes, we have a lot of people who benefit from the criminal system by having a job. Crime is a threat to public, and the police are an important way of maintaining order in society. The legal system, the functional perspective, looks at the manifest function. It's there to uphold the law, evaluate people whether they're innocent or guilty, and adjudicate, send them to prison or fine them or do whatever. The latent function of the legal system, again, is providing jobs to people who deal with criminals. So you've got judges, you have DAs, you have public defenders, you have the person who types, the county clerk, and you've got all these jobs that are coming through the criminal system. The last step in our process is corrections, parole, probation, prison. The structural functional perspective argues that the correction system has functions, manifest functions. Some of them are revenge and retribution, if you think about it. If somebody kills one of your family members, if somebody hurts your friend, in a sense, you do want a little bit of retribution and revenge, don't you? And knowing that that person is in a bad place sort of makes you feel good. The other functions of corrections are removing dangerous people from society. If there's a child molester or a murderer, you have to get them out of that community and put them in a prison. The other functions of corrections are justice and deterrence. Of course, the conflict approach would disagree with all of these manifest functions, but it's hard to dismiss them completely.